And there's a final sort of footnote. Creativity is caused, and we may talk more about it, by learning about what you don't know. If you know about a subject, and the more you know about a subject, the less you understand it in many ways. You become stale, and the excitement disappears. Adam Smith said, discovery comes out of wonder and surprise. Gosh, and why? And what tends to happen to many people and academics is they lose that sense of wonder and surprise. One reason again why childhood is so important, because that's the central feature of being a child, is the constant sense of wonder and surprise, because you don't know it and you have to learn it. And so I've always felt, and I learned this also from Ernest Gellner and from Jack Goody and Max Weber and others, that the really creative people I admired were people who seemed to be constantly learning something new. Jack Goody was a very good example. You know, you'd ask him what he was working on and he would say flowers or cooking or love or something. And you'd say, well, you weren't working on that last year, were you, Jack? Oh, no, it's a new thing. What do you know about it? Nothing, but that's why I'm doing it, etc. So having a base of knowledge, which is what I formed through my early years, and I've accumulated, you know, PhDs and degrees and a base. So when I was accused, Alan, you're flipping around all the time, what have you done with your life? You can say, well, this I do know about, and these are my books on that. But now I want to do something different. Because, as I often use as a metaphor, in the part of the world where I grew up, on the borders of Burma, they have a form of cultivation called slash and burn. It's called in Yorkshire, it's called swidden. And what it means is that the sun shines, the plants grow up, the nutrients and the carbons are stored in the plants. The tribe comes along and they cut down in New Guinea or wherever it is, they cut down the trees and the undergrowth and they burn it. And then they hoe the ashes into the earth and they get a wonderful crop because it's years or hundreds of years of sunlight. And they do that for 4 or 5 years. And then it's gone. The nutrients are gone and the energy, and the crops get smaller and smaller and smaller. So they then leave that area and move on. It's called shifting cultivation or slash and burn. They may have one where it's such a big forest, they just go on forever. Often they go for 20, 30 years and then come back. Now, I've often thought of academic life, the best academic life, both in terms of my own enjoyment and also in producing something interesting, as shifting cultivation. You know about this subject or this place, and beside it is another subject which you don't know about. So you know about Nepal, but what about Japan? Or you know about witchcraft, what about love? And so you move. Now, to do that, it sounds easy enough, but to do it both against the vested interests of all the people who are in Japan and who say, Alan, hang on, what do you know about Japan? Do you read the language, etc.? I remember, I'm sure he won't mind, but when I wrote to Keith Thomas and suggested that my book on Fukuzawa Yukichi might be included in his Oxford series, Past Masters, he wrote me a very Keithish letter saying, of course, how delightful, but do you speak Japanese? Or some words to that effect. In other words, you know, who would take it seriously? Now, you have to be very foolhardy, self-confident, prepared to take knocks, or not read the correspondence or the reviews. And you have to take a leap of faith In creativity theory, David Perkins, an American at Harvard, one of his theories as to why many people were not created was a theory which he called Oasis, the Oasis Trap. And the Oasis Trap is what, say, an average academic or most people get into. They do their PhD on 17th century Puritan sects. And everyone said, Alan, you are the world expert on 17th century Puritan sects. But you want to go and do something on the 19th century Protestants or whatever. And you have to learn a whole new vocabulary, a whole new literature. You have to know who the key people are. In other words, you have to set out from a place which has given you a good living with its date palms and water and everything, across an empty desert. And modern academic life inhibits this even more because your professor is sitting there, as happened to me even towards the end, and they call you up every 2 or 3 years and they say, Alan, look, we've got this research assessment exercise coming up. What have you produced in the last 2 or 3 years? And you say, well, actually, I'm working on a new field. I've moved, and in 2 or 3 years, I'll have an important set of work on this. But it takes 3 or 4 or 5 years to do it. I remember saying this when the research assessment exercise was invented by the government. And they said to Cambridge, we won't give you funding unless you do this. And I, at the time, said, well, if you'd said this to Darwin in 1937, and you'd said, oh, Mr. Darwin, what have you produced in the last few years? Or in 1856, Mr. Darwin, you don't seem to have produced much in the last 5 years. I think we'll cut your funding. He'd say, well, actually, in 2 years, I'll produce a book that will change the world. Well, that's no good in 2 years. Yeah. So basically, academic life requires a building up, a confidence to go somewhere else. And of course, as with Jack and others, it's a way of working which builds up confidence, because the first time you move from an oasis to another oasis across the desert, it looks as if there's going to be nothing there.